Communist China finally allowed World Health Organization investigators to look into the origins of COVID-19. What did they find? President of the Population Research Institute, Stephen MOSHER, is here with analysis. And pro-life speakers are targeted by students at two major Catholic universities as the cancel culture arrived on Catholic campuses. Civil rights activist Dr. ALVEDA King and the African nation of Cameroon has been torn apart by violence in what amounts to a civil war. What is fueling the conflict? And why is it being ignored? Father WILFRED EMEH is here to tell us. Finally, how has COVID affected the operations of museums in Rome and around the world? Author and art historian Liz Lev has an update. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. A happy Mardi Gras to you. An important show tonight. Stephen MOSHER, ALVEDA King, Father WILFRED EMEH, and Liz Lev are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover. First, some news. On Tuesday, Hong Kong's top court denied bail to media tycoon and Beijing critic Jimmy Lai. Mr. Lai is a devout Catholic and the most high-profile person to be charged under the city's national security law. Lai is accused of conspiring with foreign entities to endanger national security. He was originally detained in August 2020 after a police raid on his Apple Daily head office. He was released on bail, but then rearrested in December. Previously, those accused of nonviolent crimes in Hong Kong were granted bail, but the new law removes that presumption. China introduced the security law in the territory last year, saying it would ensure stability, but critics say it silenced dissent. More on this with Steve MOSHER. Now I want to share this with you. This is Peter Mbarek. He is a World Health Organization official. This is his assessment of an investigation into the origins of COVID in Wuhan, China. Watch.
We also looked, for example, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology BSL-4 level laboratory and the state of that laboratory, and it was very unlikely that anything could escape from such a place. And we also know that when lab accidents happen, they are, of course, extremely rare. If you look at the history of lab accidents, these are extremely rare.
The Communist Chinese government finally allowed a WHO team into the country over 1 year after they had requested to investigate ground zero of this virus. What was actually learned, and can we trust the results of this investigation? Here with analysis is president of the Population Research Institute, author of The Bully of Asia, Stephen MOSHER. Steve, I want to start with this WHO investigation. What were your thoughts after hearing this rather perfunctory assessment, a poo-pooing really, of the possible origins of this pandemic and that it broke out of that lab in Wuhan?
Raymond, this was a setup from the get-go. Many of us last January and February said this probably was created in a lab. The lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China. It probably escaped from the lab or was deliberately released from the lab. We were called at that time conspiracy theorists by the same gentleman who was part of the WHO delegation to Wuhan, a fellow by the name of Peter Daszak, who works with EcoHealth Alliance. And Peter Daszak, who called me and others a conspiracy theorist, was actually in the business of funding research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the money was coming from NIH, from Dr. Fauci's shop. So when you send the fox to guard the chicken coop, when you send the fox to report on what's happening in the chicken coop, you're probably not going to find out very much about what actually did happen. And as far as getting into the P4 lab, look, there were over a dozen delegation members. They were only in the Wuhan Institute of Virology for several hours. it takes 15 minutes to change clothes, shower, and get dressed with the protective equipment per person to get into the lab, and another 15 minutes to disinfect coming out. There's no way they could have been in the lab for any length of time, done any research, and left the lab. So I think that whole that was a show exercise. It was a propaganda exercise. They've had a year. In the last year, Raymond, they could have rebuilt the Wuhan Institute of Virology P4 lab from the ground up. We know they destroyed the results of hundreds of experiments.
Yeah, well, that was my thought. I mean, it took them over a year for the communist government to even agree to let this team that they practically own at the WHO to come in. There was plenty of time to destroy evidence, cover up whatever had been created there. Do you think anything was learned from this investigation, or was it all a sham?
I think it was all a sham. And look at what China's been saying about this from the get-go. First, they said a bat flew into someone's soup in Wuhan from a bat cave 800 miles away. Then they said that a pangolin, a little scaly anteater, was the host that had crossed over from the pangolin to humans. Then they said it came from the U.S. Army Fort Detrick's biological weapons lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, brought over by the U.S. Army during the military games in October of 2019. Then they said, no, it came from a bat cave in 2013. Then they said, no, in 2017, a researcher was bitten by a bat in the lab. I mean, and now they're blaming the United States again. So if they've changed their story 6 times, that suggests to me a cover-up.
According to the WHO, as we heard earlier, it would be very unlikely that the virus could have escaped from that lab, and that accidents like this are very rare, Steve. The focus seems to be back on the wet market theory, that frozen food supplies could be to blame. But the same WHO has already stated back in January that there's no evidence to date of viruses that cause respiratory illnesses being transmitted via food or food packaging. Does any of this pass muster with you?
No, none of this makes sense. If you freeze an organism, most of them don't survive the freezing process. So the idea that it's coming into China on packages of frozen fish, for example, I think this is just a way of shifting blame overseas, and also of punishing countries that happen to speak up about the real origin of the virus in Wuhan, China. They use economic warfare, the Chinese Communist Party does, and they're using it very effectively when it comes to the China virus.
State Department spokesman Ned Price had this to say. Listen.
I don't think there is any reasonable person who would argue that the coronavirus originated elsewhere. So that is why our focus is on this WHO investigation.
Now, John Radcliffe, the former director of national intelligence, told Fox News that, according to his sources, the Chinese military ordered the Wuhan Institute of Virology to begin experimenting with COVID strains as far back as 2017. Does that seem plausible? And does it square with what we're hearing from your sources, Steve?
Well, it absolutely does, because we know that the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army has been interested in developing biological weapons for a long time. It's part of their doctrine. I have documents in Chinese that I could share with people that state that the new high ground in warfare is the development of biological weapons, bioweapons that target specific ethnicities. Again, that target specific ethnicities. So that's what they've been working on. Everything in China that is high-tech has dual-use purposes. It has civilian use and it has a military use. When the breakout happened from the lab, I believe, of the China virus, the first person on the scene was the People's Liberation Army General Chun Wei, who's responsible for the biological weapons program. So what does this tell you? It tells you that she had oversight of what happened to the lab. It did come out of the lab. And as far as labs leaking, look, the SARS virus back a few years ago leaked from a P3 lab in Beijing twice, I think in 2013 and 2014. Twice it got out of the lab. So there's a long history of, especially in China, where they don't pay close attention to careful lab protocol, of these things getting out of the lab. So all of this
is very rare,
sham,
Steve. Very rare, the WHO says.
Well, it's very rare when they want to deny that they're a close partner of the Chinese Communist Party, who basically, I mean, they're working now for the Chinese Communist Party as part of this cover-up. And I think it's a grave mistake on the part of the United States to rejoin the World Health Organization when it's participating in fact, in covering up a pandemic that originated in China. And in fact, spreading false information. Remember last January, they were telling us there's no human-to-human transmission. That's why we're all wearing masks, right? Because there's no human-to-human transmission. So WHO is complicit in this. The WHO delegation visiting Wuhan was carefully selected and included people who were working with the lab on different research projects. So this was compromised by the get-go. We've got to keep digging, and we've got to hold China accountable for the trillions in dollars in damages, economic damages, and millions of lives lost from this pandemic, which was caused by China.
That's an interesting transition point. The Biden administration announced this week a new task force to address its policy toward China and the threat it may pose to U.S. interests. What are your impressions, first of all, of this task force? Is it credible? And is this new administration taking the threat of communist China seriously?
Well, the task force is being set up in the Pentagon, and I think what the task force will find is that the policy put in place beginning in 2017 by the Trump administration is precisely the right approach to China. We have to understand that China is led by a Chinese Communist Party that is hostile to faith, hostile to the United States, hostile to the free market, to democracy, hostile to the current world order, and wants to replace it with something modeled on Communist Party dictatorship. That's not a world that we want to live in. And remember, this is not a partisan comment for presidential administration after administration in the 80s and 90s and early years of this century. We had administrations, Democrat and Republican, that were thinking that China eventually was going to go our way. The Communist Party was going to moderate its stance. It was going to move towards the middle. It was going to allow the free market and human rights and other things. In fact, it's been moving in the opposite direction towards a fascist dictatorship, really not a communist dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship where you have elements of the free market, but only because they're efficient and they produce wealth. And the Communist Party is using that wealth to aggrandize its power and spread its influence around the world. So finally, over the last few years, we've gotten China policy right, and we need to stay the course. If we back away from that policy, we're going to compromise our own future, the future of our children and grandchildren.
On Wednesday evening, President Biden had his first call with President Xi Jinping of China. During that 2-hour call, the president raised China's human rights record as well as recent aggressive expansionism. Now, Xi has defended his policies as a matter of Chinese sovereignty, cautioning President Biden that a confrontation would be a disaster. How do you read in between the lines here? And are you convinced that the United States has a stance and a position now to warrant the respect of the Chinese?
Well, what we see China doing is drawing a series of red lines. And they say you cannot cross these red lines. And one red line is Taiwan. Taiwan is our sovereign territory, they claim, and you should not interfere when we try to retake Taiwan. South China Sea, another red line. You can't cross that red line. You can't criticize human rights in China. That's another red line. So they're trying to take things off the table, Raymond, so that we can't discuss them in these diplomatic exchanges. And they're only willing to discuss things that are to their advantage. So those are not the conditions under which we should be having these diplomatic discussions. We've got to press China on human rights. We've got to press China with regard to the genocide of the Uyghurs and the persecution of Christians and Catholics in China. We've got to stop them from seizing territory, not just in the South China Sea and making aggressive acts towards Taiwan, but, for example, building a port in the Bahamas, 100 miles off the coast of Florida, building artificial islands near Australia to put pressure on Australia, one of our good allies in the South Pacific. So China is moving aggressively on all points of the compass, and I think we have to challenge them on all points of the compass.
Are you surprised that President Biden has decided to leave the Trump-era trade tariffs in place against China? A wise move?
Well, it absolutely is a wise move because American free labor cannot compete with Chinese slave labor. And I use the word slave deliberately because we know that the Uyghur minorities and the Kazakh minorities in the far west of China are actually being sold in tranches of 100 to factories on the east coast of China to produce goods for export. This is literally slave labor. They're kept penned up during the week, only allowed out under escort for a few hours on Sunday afternoon. So that's slave labor. As far as the rest of labor in China, they're not allowed to organize, demonstrate, set up free labor unions. So they're a controlled labor force as well. Wages can be kept low. It is impossible for free workers to compete with that kind of serf and slave labor under the control, under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. So keep the tariffs in place and, in fact, move forward aggressively to rebuilding American industry and putting American workers back to work.
Well, Steve, it's a perverse irony, isn't it, that the Chinese loose this virus on the world, and now, this week, the Congress is moving an aid package, a supplemental stimulus package that includes a $15 minimum wage that will decimate small business and manufacturing. And yet, we're supposed to compete with the Chinese. It's rather remarkable if the Chinese did, in fact, orchestrate this thing.
Well, they certainly tried to take advantage of it, and they've taken advantage of it in multiple ways. One way, of course, is by selling literally $70–80 billion worth of PPE around the world, face masks and protective equipment. So you release a virus on the world, and then you profit from that by selling at exorbitant prices the material you need to protect yourself against it. And of course, they're selling vaccines left, right, and center as well. Their vaccines don't work very well. The vaccines from China have a 50 to 60% efficiency, if that. That's what's claimed. So they're profiting from this mightily. And we need to be very clear-eyed about the fact that China poses the paramount threat to the world as we know it. And not just to Americans and to Europeans, but to the Chinese people themselves. Remember that there are 90 million or more Chinese who are not alive today because they were killed in various pogroms, persecutions, purges within the borders of China itself.
Were you surprised that the Biden administration decided to drop requirements put in place by the Trump administration for U.S. schools and universities to disclose their arrangements with the Chinese government-backed Confucius Institutes? These are on-campus programs. Now, this was done without explanation at the end of January. Your reaction, and given that these institutes are basically fronts for the communist government, are you concerned about this?
Well, I am. I testified back in 2010 before the U.S. Congress on the fact that China was moving aggressively to set up propaganda outlets on American college campuses. And that's what these places are. These so-called Confucius Institutes really should be called Xi Jinping Institutes. They claim to teach the Chinese language, but they teach a history of China according to the Chinese Communist Party. They promote the idea that China has a superior form of government to American democracy. And they generally propagandize young Americans who are, my goodness, illiterate enough about American history and about the constitutional republic that they live in. They don't need to be exposed to propaganda paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, deliberately designed to undermine their faith in their own system of government and create an allegiance to a foreign power that is hostile to the United States and its values. And all the Trump administration had done was require colleges and universities to report their relationship to a Confucius Institute. They hadn't banned them. And now even that reporting requirement has been taken away. And I think that Beijing must be very happy about that particular action and indeed about a number of actions that the Biden administration has quietly taken to take some of the pressure off China. For example, canceling the Keystone Pipeline. Some of that oil will now go to China. China is very happy about that. For example, canceling the requirement that no power generating equipment or power transmission equipment can be sourced in China because of the possibility that China may put a kill switch on a transformer and shut off electricity to U.S. cities in the event of a conflict. That's gone away now. That's under review. That will make Beijing very happy as well. So the rhetoric on China is still fairly tough, Raymond, but we have to be careful to watch what happens behind the scenes, because any softening of our stance towards China will be seized by them, by the hawks in China, to encourage more aggressive acts towards Taiwan, towards our allies in the Asia Pacific who are on the front lines.
Yeah. China's questionable treatment of Christians also continues, Steve. I mean, just this week, we're seeing reports that Christian churches in the Shandong province have been banned from publishing audio and videos of sermons, preachings from online gatherings and services. The decree banning such activity was posted on January 29th. What do you make of the action to ban these online services, Christian services, from being distributed? And the decree mentions maintaining public opinion security. What is that?
Well, public opinion security means that everyone has to adhere to the party line in China. And of course, the party line is that one should, if you're in China, be loyal to and indeed worship the Chinese Communist Party and its leader, Xi Jinping, and not engage in superstitious activities such as going to Catholic or Christian church services. But this is also kind of a bait and switch, because when they closed down church services in China on the grounds that they were places where the China virus would be spread, where COVID-19 would be spread, they told pastors and priests that they could broadcast their sermons online. Well, now, without reopening the in-person church services, they're closing down the online the live stream church services. They're closing down audio and video recordings and making that a crime. And remember, back in 2018, they took responsibility away from the State Administration for Religious Affairs and put it in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department directly. So the Communist Party, which itself is a kind of pseudo-religion, is in charge of overseeing the real faiths of China. And what do they want to do? Well, they want to stamp out the competition, Raymond, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're afraid of Christianity in particular because it's spreading rapidly in China.
Steve, it's breathtaking, and the reportage on this in the United States is practically nil. I mean, but for this program and a handful of others, you're not going to hear anything about what's actually going on, not only behind the scenes in China, but in the minds of the Chinese officials. This is what they seek to impose, not only on their own people, but on the world. As you've written eloquently for so many years, they see themselves as the hegemon, the leader of the whole world, and the controller of the fortunes of the world. Before we go, we've got to talk about the current state of this Vatican-China agreement. Again, we still know nothing of the terms, but recently Cardinal Pietro Parolin gave an interview urging patience regarding the deal. He described it as a step-by-step diplomacy effort. Meanwhile, Asia News reports this week that China's State Administration for Religious Affairs has launched a database that contains all information on religious personnel. What do you know about this database, and what could the Vatican possibly be thinking in terms of this step-by-step diplomacy when it comes to a regime like China?
Well, the database by the State Administration for Religious Affairs was set up back in 2013, 2014. So it's been in existence for some time, and now they've moved the database to the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party. So everybody in China is literally being watched all the time. Especially pastors and priests are under 24/7 surveillance, trying to limit their effectiveness, trying to prevent the spread of the gospel. They won't succeed, but of course, the Communist Party is certainly trying. It now runs the world's first high-tech digital dictatorship, where everybody is being surveilled all the time. Some of you watching may have read George Orwell's 1984, where the authorities were watching through the TV screen. Well, that's real life in China today. They're watching you through your computer. They're watching you through your cell phone. They're watching you through the video surveillance cameras installed by the millions throughout Chinese cities. And so artificial intelligence, big data, people are being tracked, people are being watched. In fact, China is trying to create a database of everyone in the entire world, starting with the elites. If that isn't a wake-up call for the rest of us, I don't know what is.
Finally, we had that Jimmy Lai story at the top of the show. Your reaction to denying him bail and imprisoning this man. I mean, he's a man he's a media mogul, but I imagine a voice that's a threat to the regime, so they have to put him down.
Well, Jimmy Lai runs Apple Daily, which is the last free media in Hong Kong. which is now being crushed, under the hobnail boot of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think he's prepared for martyrdom. He has said in the past that he understands he may go to prison for the rest of his life. And prison in China, where he will probably be serving his sentence, is not a pleasant place. It involves torture, it involves sleep deprivation, minimal food, all sorts of pressure put on you, and not just to serve out your term, which may in Jimmy Lai's case be a life sentence, but also to confess your crime. So we need to be praying for Jimmy Lai and his sons, who were also arrested, and for everyone in Hong Kong, from Cardinal Sin on down, who are all now in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party for wanting what? For wanting what should be their birthright, the right of every man and woman to live free and breathe free and practice their faith.
Stephen Mosher, thank you for eloquently articulating the plight of these people that for too long have been ignored and continue to maliciously be ignored today by some of those in our own government and elites elsewhere. Stephen's book, Bully of Asia, is available everywhere, online and at bookstores. Steve, thanks again.
Thank you.
ALVEDA King is up next, but first, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that California Governor Gavin Newsom's ban on indoor church services may be unconstitutional. The order effectively lifts the state ban on indoor religious gatherings. In a 6-3 decision, the justices granted an appeal late Friday evening from a South San Diego church that challenged the restrictions. While granting the right to gather and worship, the Supreme Court said limiting attendance to 25% of the building's capacity is acceptable, and restrictions on singing and chanting could also be relaxed. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco, who's been on this program regularly, has been petitioning the state for the right to worship indoors for months now. So this is welcome news. My next guest participated in the Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life, an annual pro-life event organized by Georgetown University a few weeks ago. Now, pro-abortion students at the university have submitted a petition calling her out for opposition to same-sex marriage, support for former President Donald Trump, and criticism of the Black Lives Matter organization. The petition contains anonymous statements from undergraduate students alleging that they now feel unsafe as a result of this event, which was virtual, by the way. She's the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King and Director of Civil Rights for the Unborn at Priests for Life. Please welcome back to the program, ALVEDA King. ALVEDA, thank you for being here. I want to get your reaction to this petition. What did you think when you read this, and in what way do you think you made these students feel unsafe?
Raymond, I want to give you this little caveat first. Things have changed so much. You know, it wasn't too long ago, prior to COVID, that you and I could be sitting right across from each other in your studio. Yep. And we could have a conversation. You could see my body language, I could see yours, you could hear the warmth of my tone, and you could really see my face. Now we have masks, we have to do all of this virtual work. And so everything has been so depersonalized that the students probably do feel uncomfortable by some of the information that was shared in that conference. It makes me feel uncomfortable too, but they have no reason to fear ALVEDA King. ALVEDA King is about love. My uncle, Martin Luther King Jr., said, I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. But this isn't the first time, Raymond. I've had these kinds of things. I've had events canceled because students said they were so terrified. Well, you know, the information about abortion is terrifying. That's why it needs to stop.
Oh, so that's what makes them feel unsafe. They're terrified by the facts surrounding abortion? Is that it?
Well, we were talking about human trafficking on the call, about abortion, about how women are being harmed by abortion. We talked about the women in China with the forced one child or two in some instances now. So to get all of that information when students would rather not think about it, that can actually be uncomfortable. But, you know, sometimes you have to have that creative tension to cause people to open their eyes and to care about somebody beyond them. And that's, so I understand they're not afraid of me. I don't believe that. How can they be afraid of me? A 70-year-old woman who loves everybody. That's just not true. But they are uncomfortable because these are uncomfortable times.
Yeah. The students are demanding, Alveda, that the university administrators issue a campus-wide email, quote, explicitly condemning the unjust, appalling actions of Cardinal O'Connor, as well as the racist, misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic rhetoric of the keynote speaker and panelists, end quote. Are these students even remotely aware of your background? I mean, your last name should have been a hint, right?
And they don't know, and they don't even understand the man who said, I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. They didn't meet my dad, Reverend A.D. King, Alfred Daniel Williams King, who, when his brother was shot, wrapped his arms around me and said, you can't hate anybody. You can't hate white people. You can't hate anybody. You have to love and forgive. They don't know that history. And Cardinal O'Connor, who just said, love your neighbor as yourself, so treat everybody with the same love and consideration that you want. And now they want to attack the Cardinal's legacy as well. But that's lack of understanding, you know? And so without being taught, they are reacting, and they don't know me. I love them.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of amazed about the Cardinal O'Connor hit, given this is the man who cared for AIDS patients in the early days of that epidemic. I remember being in New York, and look, I was in the theater community, so I knew people who were being cared for at the unit he helped set up at St. Clair's Hospital, at St. Vincent's. Mother Teresa's Order in the Village was the only one caring for AIDS patients at the time. Do these students' claims of racism and homophobia ring hollow to you, given that background?
Those claims of racism ring hollow because science, if they really open their science books, will show them that we are one human race. We're not separate races. We are one human race. Act 1726, one blood, one human race. Now, they're frightened of me. They are angry with the Cardinal. And yet, now, what would happen if I were to say, I'm feeling uncomfortable about this petition? It's making me feel uneasy. Somebody rebuke those students for that petition. Then they would say, look at that fraud, look at that phony. She's not afraid. So I'm saying that the way to get past fear is to communicate and to use agape love. That's not being taught. I don't think they know what that means. And I'm sure that they cannot understand the King family legacy, which says to love your brothers and sisters, to be kind to your brothers and sisters. That would include the little babies in the womb. And I believe that that is the issue that's making them uncomfortable, Raymond.
Well, it's amazing to me that a Catholic university, the premier Catholic university, Georgetown University, that this is coming from within that particular place, which you'd think might understand not only Dr. King's legacy, but the legacy upon which King stood, which was Jesus Christ's legacy. Has anyone at Georgetown reached out to you or spoken to you about this petition?
I've not heard anything directly. I'm very aware of the petition. And I'm not planning to retaliate with rebuttal and anger. I am giving an open invitation. I hope they see this. Let's communicate. Let's meet on Zoom or Skype or somewhere and have another conversation. I'm happy to meet them in the public square of the virtual public square.
Alveda, your case kind of jumped out at me because at the same time, Abby Johnson, the former Planned Parenthood director, now a pro-life advocate, was canceled at Catholic University of America. She had a speech there to a pro-life group, and the chaplain apparently, allegedly, put pressure on the head of the pro-life group to cancel Ms. Johnson's speech. Did you ever think we'd be in a moment where cancel culture was raging on Christian and Catholic campuses in this way?
In a nation, this is the United States of America, we have fought for free speech, that constitutional right. And now the cancel culture is attempting to erase the rights of American people to express peacefully our views. So I never imagined that that would happen. But as I say, prayer was taken out of schools in 63. Abortion became legal in 73. We've been on a course. It's time to change that trajectory. It's time to change. It's time to get back to seeing each other as one race, human beings, the human race, and to communicate. I'm not afraid of them. I really don't believe that they're afraid of me. I do believe they may be uncomfortable because these issues are very uncomfortable. When we begin to imagine what happens to a little baby in the womb whose life is ended, or an 8-year-old child that is allowed to have transfiguring surgery, something cut off of their body because they want to be something different, without the knowledge that if I change my mind back, I can never get that back. Those are things, when you think about it, that's uncomfortable. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but we must have these conversations. Hey, they can meet me in the virtual public square in a peaceful manner. I'd love to talk about this.
Yeah, Alveda, the thing I'm struck by is no matter where people come down on these issues, the very idea that young people should hear a monologue from one side of America and exclude other ideas that maybe they don't have at the moment or that the faculty doesn't have at the moment. I thought the whole purpose of education was opening yourself up to the marketplace of ideas and then having that debate. That's where that should happen. So I'm deeply concerned that we are homogenizing thought for students. Does that concern you, particularly Christian
free
thought?
Our minds. We can free our minds. We can talk about different opinions, different perspectives. We should be able to do that. But that's almost like a long time ago, books were collected and they would burn books and you could only read this book and read that. Well, now you can only have this thought, no other thoughts. You can't think anything else. We cancel you if you say something we do not agree with. And the professors are really leading those young people along in that manner. That is very unfortunate. But I believe we have an obligation as Christians, as people of kindness and love, to continue to communicate and share truth in the public square. How are we going to do that if they keep shutting us down at every place? Well, we pray and we continue.
I love that. And I love the idea, free your mind. And you can only have a free mind if you have a free body and a free soul and free heart.
That's right.
And so let's pray that that happens. Dr. Alveda King, thank you for being here as always.
Good to join you.
Some positive news. A French nun who happens to be Europe's oldest living person has survived COVID-19 on this, her 117th birthday. Sister Andre, formerly Lucille Randon, was born on February 11th, 1904. She tested positive for the virus on January 16th, but was asymptomatic, not even realizing she had it. She immediately quarantined from her fellow residents at the St. Catherine Labouré retirement home in southern France. She is now fully recovered. Sister Andre is blind and gets around in a wheelchair, but's marking her special day at home with a small number of friends. God bless her. And just in time for Lent and Easter, my new picture book, The Thief Who Stole Heaven, premieres March 9th. It tells the dramatic, hidden story of a figure you probably have heard about, but know very little of, the good thief, Dismas. Now, this is his backstory, and it's based on writings of saints like Augustine, John Chrysostom, and others. It's an adventure story for the whole family and will make a wonderful Easter gift. The Thief Who Stole Heaven hits shelves March 9th. You can pre-order your copy or copies at the EWTN Religious Catalog, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Go to discoverlegends.com or my website for more information. And we are going to be announcing a very special The Thief Who Stole Heaven event here on EWTN very soon. So stay tuned for that. We're planning it now. Now, since 2016, Cameroon has been awash in violence owing to clashes between the minority English-speaking separatists in the north and southwest regions and the French-speaking majority who support the current government. The separatists claim they do not have equal rights and want to secede from Cameroon. To date, the violence between the two groups continues, with Catholics on both sides caught in the crossfire. Joining me now to discuss what's happening in his native country is Associate Pastor of St. Agnes Parish in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Father WILFRED EMEH. Father, thank you for being here. For 3 years now, the English-speaking regions in Cameroon have attempted to break away from the country's French-speaking majority to establish their own state, Ambazonia. What is the current situation on the ground in Cameroon as these two sides continue to skirmish?
Thank you, Raymond, for having me, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to the world about the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. The situation on the ground is still horrible. Like you mentioned in your introduction, the cause of this Anglophone crisis is the failure of the central government of Cameroon to respect and implement the Equal Status Clause of the Constitution. The Anglophone Cameroons, the minority, joined the majority Francophones in 1961. And according to that Equal Status Clause, the Anglophones are a people with a distinct culture and language. And for over decades, this equal rights, equal status, equal representation in the government has been disrespected. So the people have been disgruntled for a very long time because of perceived marginalization. And Raymond, let me say this. You know, in 1986, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States cautioned the Cameroon government that continuous failure to respect the linguistic and cultural distinctions of the Anglophones will eventually lead the Anglophones to take up arms as the only solution for their rights and privileges.
Father, there are approximately 6 million Catholics in Cameroon. They make up about 38% of the population. 2 million live in the English-speaking north and southwest regions of the country. The remaining 4 million, as you mentioned, are French-speaking areas. How are these Catholics faring in the country? Are they fighting amongst one another?
Raymond, the Catholics are in the crossroads. In the English-speaking region of Cameroon, when the crisis started, the bishops wrote a memorandum to the president calling his attention to widespread social injustice. Our churches at that time were closed. Our schools, Catholic schools, were closed. As I speak with you, a presbytery in the English-speaking region was completely burnt down. Some priests were targeted, and one or two of them were unjustly detained. So the bishops of Cameroon actually addressed this memorandum and called the president's attention of these issues. Unfortunately, when the crisis started, the government denied that the Anglophone problem existed. They have acknowledged it right now, but too little, too late. As I speak with you, there are over 1 million internally displaced. Many of them are Catholics. I am a board member of an organization. We help the refugees. Majority of those refugees are Catholic Christians, and there are hundreds of them in Nigeria. So we are in a very precarious situation. The pandemic is on. There is civil unrest, and the separatists are out there.
Yeah. There have been several reports, Father, of Catholics being killed. 7 students were killed at a Catholic school this past October by separatists. In February, 22 children and a pregnant mother were killed by government forces. As you mentioned, a seminarian and priest were killed in 2018. And this past November, a Cardinal Tumi, was kidnapped by gunmen and then released. Have Catholics become a target in this battle between these two sides?
Raymond, certainly the Catholics have become a target because there is a cathedral in Cameroon that has bullet holes all over. And a priest was killed right in front of the rectory. A seminarian was killed in front of the church. And the victims of the Ngabo incidents that you just mentioned, over 22, majority of them were Catholics. That's a Catholic predominant diocese in Cameroon, the Diocese of Kumbo. And then the school you mentioned also, that's Mother Francisca Bilingual School. Majority of the residents in that area are Catholics. So in many, many and subtle ways, Catholics have been targeted. I remember a priest who was presenting the humanitarian report, and the flagrant violation of human rights was unjustly detained. Cardinal Tumi was kidnapped because he's vocal. Yeah.
2 weeks ago, Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin made a visit to Cameroon. Now, some separatists called for businesses to close in protest of the visit, accusing the church of being indifferent to their plight. Now, during Mass on January 31st, Cardinal Parolin had this to say to the people of Cameroon.
The Holy Father unites himself to the desire for peace and reconciliation that rises up to God. We are all responsible for peace. All the actors of society are responsible, from the smallest to the biggest person. No one can feel exonerating from the struggle against evil. This is the challenge that faces you today.
The Vatican has called for dialogue between the two sides, Father, not for the first time. But many people in Cameroon see one country with two cultures, as you mentioned earlier, the French side and the English side. The overwhelming majority of the English-speaking side want a separate country. Is dialogue possible at this point?
Raymond, a lot has already gone wrong. When this crisis started, dialogue would have been possible, and it would have been easier. But right now, as we speak, there are several fractions of the separatist group. Unfortunately, both sides are not willing to listen to each other. What is dialogue? Is talking and listening to each other. And for dialogue to be fruitful, we have to put all the cards on the table. The first dialogue that the government had, it seems to have been on the terms of the government. So the separatists were dissatisfied. In a situation where the people have lost trust in their government, we cannot have genuine dialogue without a neutral arbiter. The government had an upper hand in the former dialogue. That is why it did not work. But I think, like the Cardinal Secretary said, all of us are responsible for this. I think dialogue can still go forward if both sides are willing to listen to each other. In order for us to compromise, we have to shift to the middle. Unfortunately, now we have some extremists who will not want to shift, and the government also consider some topics as taboo. We cannot be talking about dialogue when the government cannot bring onto the table federation, separate. Let us talk about the issues, because that is what the people care about.
In 2019, the U.S. cut Cameroon from a trade pact over allegations of human rights violations, allegedly committed by Cameroon's security forces. The U.S. also cut more than $17 million in security aid and support over the country's human rights records. How has that affected the country, and do people have any faith in this government at this point?
Raymond, the truth is, this crisis has been neglected by the international community. That decision to cut funds from the Cameroon military came in too little, too late. I'm sorry to say that, because on the 1st of October 2017, the Anglophone Cameroons staged a peaceful march in Boya. That's where I come from. Raymond, they were massacred. Dozens of young people were massacred. Nothing was said about it in the international media. There was no international pressure on the central government of Cameroon. And about the same time, you know, the Catalans in Spain, they were also fighting for independence. Not a single person was killed in Catalonia, but it was all over the international media. Raymond, thank you for bringing me on, because one of the big problems in the Anglophone crisis is that it has been neglected by the international community. I hope that the United States can put more pressure on the central government so that this dialogue should take place. They should look at the issues. We cannot have peace and reconciliation without justice, without truth.
Yeah.
Because these people have violated human rights. They are not accountable. And some time ago, about 3 years ago, a bishop was assassinated and his remains were thrown in a river. 3 years after, there is no account why Bishop Jean-Marie Bala was assassinated.
Wow. Father Emeh, we have for 25 years covered South Sudan, what's happening in Nigeria, in your home country of Cameroon, really all of Africa, because I think it's so important for everyone to understand what's actually happening and how our aid in the United States is used or misused, how the Vatican has engaged or not engaged. Now, you're stationed in the United States, but you're watching your people suffering. When you hear calls that Black Lives Matter, and yet you see people ignoring the plight of so many Black lives in your native Africa, what do you think? How do you put this together in your own head as you watch this play out?
Raymond, I want to challenge all the Cameroonians in the diaspora, those in the United States and Europe, who at the beginning of this crisis played a very important part. But right now, as we speak, it has gone off hands. There are many, many Cameroonians in the United States who are well-to-do, who are in a position that can put a little more pressure so that the Black lives in Africa that are not respected can once more gain their dignity. Truly speaking, what's going on in America is nothing compared to the flagrant violation of human rights in Africa, especially what's been going on in Cameroon for the, Raymond, it's actually like 4 years. 4 years. The Rwandan genocide lasted 100 days. But this is 4 years, and there have been cases of genocide in Cameroon. So those of us who are in the diaspora, let us come together. We have become divided, and our people are dying. They are perishing. Some of them are perishing like cockroaches. That's what is going on. But it is not said anywhere. I hope the world over will bring this news once more to the United States Congress. The Foreign Relations Committee, they should talk about it. They should put pressure on the government so that that dialogue should be real and Cameroonians can once more live in peace and harmony. Because as we speak, each day is unpredictable in Cameroon. Every Monday, there is a ghost town. People don't go out of their homes. My family is still there. Friends have been killed. So it is really, really a hard time.
Well, Father, I thank you for bringing it to our attention and to the attention of the audience, and we'll stay in touch with you. Father WILFRED EMEH, thank you again, and we'll continue to pray for the people of Cameroon.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you for having me.
Here now to discuss the economic impact art museums have suffered in the past year due to COVID, as well as the celebration of the 700th anniversary of Italian poet Dante's death, is art historian and author of How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, Dr. Elizabeth Lev. She's joining us from Rome. Liz, thanks for being with us. I want to begin with the Vatican Museums, which just reopened after being shut down for nearly 3 months. This was the second time the museum closed. In a normal year, nearly 7 million people would have visited. In 2020, only 1.3 million walked through the doors. What has been the economic impact on the museum and the Vatican itself?
Well, the economic impact of the closings for the pandemic have been truly terrible. They've been devastating for what is 13.2% of the GDP of Italy, let alone Vatican City State. I was at the Vatican Museums on 2 days ago after 88 days of being closed. 88 days. That is longer than it's been closed since the Second World War. So it was truly a very extensive period. And I have to say that there's still nobody there. So if you can imagine, in many ways, the Vatican Museums have been the economic, a power that helped to fund everything in the Vatican. And now there's nothing coming in, barely enough to keep afloat the immense number of custodians, restorers, and people who work there.
Wow. What's the experience like now for visitors? I mean, is this the moment to rush to see the Sistine Chapel without crowds, Liz?
Well, I have to say, the experience of those of us who are here and able to be here, it is extraordinary. I was, again, in the Vatican museums on Tuesday and wandered from room to room all by myself. It felt like I had the museums to myself. And I saw, a few people here and there who just, they walk around like Alice in Wonderland. Like, I can't believe this place is all to myself. So not to make your viewers jealous, but there is a teeny little ray for a few of us who are fortunate enough to be able to go to all of these museums. Everything is really got this sense of discovery and specialness.
I want to move on to the great Italian poet Dante. As we mentioned earlier, Italy will celebrate his 700th anniversary throughout the year. Most notably, 88 rarely seen drawings will be on display at the Uffizi Gallery. Now, these are pencil and ink arts from the 16th century. They were drawn by Federico Zuccari. Alongside each drawing is a corresponding verse from Dante's Inferno. Tell us what people will be seeing here and how this art complements Dante's work.
I think it's a really amazing idea on the part of the Uffizi to make these available as a virtual exposition, so people can see it without having to worry about coming to Italy. And so these drawings are online. They've been online since January 8th, and they are amazingly high resolution. These drawings, these 88 drawings by Zuccari, have never been put on display all together. They were done once, I think, in the 19th century, and then again in 1993. But now even those exhibitions were partial. So this is a chance to really go through. It's a wonderful way for people to really approach the Divine Comedy by seeing the illustrations next to the poem itself, because the poem had such an impact on art. Giotto, Michelangelo, Gustave Moreau, I mean, so many people have really engaged that amazing story.
My only frame of reference for Zuccari is the Palazzo Zuccari with those big monster faces in the doors and the windows. So I'm learning a lot here, Liz. Before I let you go, what is the role of art in preserving a culture, particularly at this moment when humanity itself is boxed away and hidden?
I think Dante is really the answer to that question. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, these 3 poems, an epic poem after Homer, after Virgil. Dante tells us the great Christian epic of salvation. And he wrote this poem in exile, while he was in exile for 20 years, trying to draw together a fractured peninsula in order around a language, around beauty. And so the way that Dante is like our Shakespeare is what he is to Italy is what Shakespeare is to English. He draws together a beauty of a language, a magnificence of a human story, trying to bring peace, even though he was a first-person victim, if you will, of the political unrest of his age. And I think that's when we find the idea that beauty really can save and beauty really can heal. And that is a role the arts should play.
Boy, we needed to hear that today. Liz Lev, thank you. Liz is the author of How Catholic Art Saved the Faith. It's available at bookstores everywhere, online, and at the EWTN Religious Catalog. Liz, thank you again.
Thank you very much.
The World Over is now available as a podcast. You can download us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You don't want to miss us, do you? That's all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, happy Mardi Gras. We'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.